So, hey Key,
His finger.
do you remember when we both became like Sigma male bodybuilders for Magic?
Following the Arnold diet.
Yeah, we did follow the Arnold Schwarzenegger patented PGM 7505 to 28 diet. So for those who aren't aware, there's a blog post about it on With Cunning Command. It's basically a one of the many rituals in the PGM for meeting with a daimon or acquiring a familiar spirit. Except unlike the ones that require deifying or drowning a bird in milk or calling Eros or Selene to bestow familiar, this one involves it's a conjuration of Helios that involves waking up at dawn, right as the sun is rising, and inscribing in I think it was Mer ink,
Yeah,
some
Murray.
some names on one egg, which you cleanse yourself with, and you lick it off, right? And
Hmm.
cleanse yourself, and then one of them gets cracked and thrown away, and the other it doesn't actually specify where you throw it away, which is why I kept joking
Yeah.
to you that we should just egg our neighbor's house once a day.
Oh, that was a joke.
Oh, no. Oops.
Nah, nah. It's fine.
Sorry to your person that you live next to.
Yeah.
And then the other one you crack down straight down your throat. You just guzzle it.
Hmm.
Drink up that holy of holies. And it's on two male eggs too, which I love the in the Bet's translation of the PGM, I do love the footnote because it mentions that like, well, according to Aristotle, a male egg would be one that's rounder, as opposed to pointy.
Hmm.
But I was like, well, in my folk culture, which is obviously correct, we consider male eggs to be the pointy ones. And guess what? So does Pliny the Elder in Natural History, Volume 10, Chapter 74. So we went with that one. I don't actually think it would have made too much of a difference, but whatever. And so
Hmm.
basically, because he and I were going to bed very late and waking up very early to do this, we would just like text each other on Discord like the egg emoji when we finished, and then went straight back to sleep. So I still sometimes like remember that time when we became, like wake up in the morning, first thing, eat a raw egg, recite a Gnostic prayer, go to sleep. Like it's truly like the Sigma male grind set, Patrick Bateman, Ryan Gosling as four different characters.
For real.
Like collage in the background. We also need Ryan Gosling as Ken as well from Barbie.
Yeah, you just wear the drive jacket, go outside, crack the egg, go back inside. It
I'm
works
pretty
out.
sure you are the drive guy.
I think that's actually me.
Yeah, I
Literally
think
me.
I think that might be literally me. God damn it. So that's it's Pacts, right? And we're very happy with the spirits we met through this ritual. We can confirm it does work. We were gonna say like we're gonna make a blog post about it even if it doesn't work, just to be like, so we didn't really experience anything. We didn't really meet any spirit. It did work, and it was great. And we loved it. But we
Mhm.
also became bodybuilders as a result. And it looks like the physical results of this paying off are visible only on P.
The thing that they don't tell you in the PGM is that for each egg you eat, you
Mhm.
gain like a kilo of muscle.
Yeah, it didn't happen to me. I'm sorry. Why did it happen to you? Why can't I be the drive guy or Arnold Schwarzenegger flexing while, Little Dark Age plays in the background?
Because I think the drive guy is literally me.
Oh, okay, you took that spot. Oh, you took his god form. You assumed it and like
Yeah.
wouldn't let it go, so you're like hogging him. Okay, I understand.
I knew the secret name of Ryan Gosling, and he act as a parhetros to
I think the Parhedros that you met through this ritual was Ryan Gosling.
we are so far away from
From reality right now. Salt help us.
You created your own predicament here, I'm afraid.
Yeah, you're right. Well, let's play the music and talk a little bit about making spirit pacts. Be not alarmed at the frightful howls which you may hear. It's finger assault and brokering agreements key.
It's also bodybuilding with raw eggs in the morning key.
Ray love steaks, key.
Well, you know what? That's the thing too, is like you're pescatarian. So when
Mhm.
you visited my family, everyone was just like, "Are you fasting for religious reasons?" Like, and they kept checking the calendars to see, like, is it, what fast are we supposed to be on the Orthodox calendar? Like, why are you eating only fish right now? Shoutouts to the Belgrade airport, by the way, for having like menus that include like a vegetarian and a fasting option, and fasting meaning like it's fish that doesn't
For
have other
real.
kinds of meat. Yeah.
That was awesome.
But there you go, a little culturally enriched on your way into Orthodox land.
You step foot over the border and immediately grow a large beard and put on a black habit.
Yeah, just whip out the prayer rope. So last episode, the materia gathering one was a popular request from the patrons, and this time around we're doing another requested episode. We have a few that we've kind of like polished up that are research episodes that are coming out soon. This one, by much popular demand, is kind of a Pacts 101 request, really. This also came from our good friend Sasha Ravich's Discord server for her Patreon members, where we were very excited to see some interest in this topic as well. One thing that we really wanted to talk about in this case was, instead of a historical overview of various kinds of spirit agreements and intimate connections between peoples and spirits, which, that can be an entire arc, frankly, of looking at various historical examples of familiar spirits in different cultures, as well as, non-consensual as well as consensual spirit pacts and marriages. Like that could be an arc of 30 plus episodes. There's infinite fuel for that one. But specifically today, we want to talk about sort of our experiences of what are agreements and pacts as more than just reciprocal agreements, but as mutually changing and reciprocally nourishing and co-creating brand new experiences and initiatory evolutions through intimate spirit agreements. So that's one of those things that we want to talk about today. And as silly as the PGM 7505 to 28 story is, the spirits that Kiyade met rock. Like, honestly, they're great. I highly recommend. It's not even a difficult one to do. They're just some PGM spells that take a bit of time to gather the materia for. This one is quite simple. Frankly, I think all you really need is the eggs as well as the myrrh ink, right?
Yeah, it's eggs, myrrh ink, and memorizing a brief string of barbarous names.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And also, I think really worth noting with that one in terms of like getting a spirit familiar to show up and to actually be, as we mentioned kind of when we wrote it together, is genuinely interested in helping you in connecting you with other beings and being an advocate for you before various spirits and the deities and so on, very much aligned in a holy, unifying, theurgic focus. I think one thing that is quite fascinating about the kind of consumption of the Orphic egg and the importance of the scarab and the sort of Egyptian mysteries present in this ritual is that really it is a modeling of a pact that is made before you meet the spirit, right? There is a kind of ingestion, there is an alchemical transformation, there is the saluting of the sun at its earliest station in the morning, right? It's actually quite a beautiful ritual. As much as my head cannot get out of the gutter with regards to just like the how very Sigma I felt waking up that early to do that. It's not hard. And I think that goes to show the kind of inherent right of theurgical communion among all created souls, right? Just to kind of Neoplatonist post for a second. I do think that shows and betrays the kind of beautiful cosmology behind a lot of these theurgical rituals within the PGM.
Definitely, yeah. Even some of like the scholarship that we invoke in the article really digs into like how the author had not only evidenced deep knowledge of the various Greek mystery cults, but also the like Egyptian mystery cults centered around like the voyage of the solar bark and all this stuff reconstructed from the corrupted names.
Absolutely. So today, so freaking glad that you're back, my love. Salt's here, ready to dispense his wisdom. And we're going to talk a little bit about basically like what are pacts. Like when we talk a lot about spirit pacts, it's kind of like a buzzword nowadays, actually, because I think the culture, the broader occult community tends to go through some trends, right? I remember when everyone was all about folk Catholicism. I remember when everyone was all about kind of like notions of traditional grimoirism. There was the whole phase of like angels. Currently, I think we're going through a bit of a fairy trend. I think we mentioned this, but certainly I think the notions of spirit pacts have pervaded all of these discussions, right? And in some cases, and keeping in mind this is our observations, these are our understandings. I think it'd be helpful to kind of give a discussion, because every single episode we've ever aired, and as well as basically every blog post, has involved us mentioning the pacts and the agreements we have with certain spirits that facilitate and allow us to create the materia that we and the talismans that we sell, allow us to obtain some of the very things that we need to do the rituals that we do, that nourish our desires, our very love for our spirits and our adoration and extreme affection for the fact that we want to protect our bonds, that we want to nourish them, that we want to work in service of them. We've mentioned learning languages for our spirits. We've mentioned learning skills to honor them, whether it's martial, physical skills, as well as actual sort of like intellectual skills and so on, like learning everything from strategy games to dedicating ourselves to learning different kinds of sonographies and so on. So I think it's worth discussing like what qualifies to us as a pact. How is a pact more than a reciprocal agreement? In the materia gathering episode just last time, Key, you shared a story of like spirit merchants, right? Like that one spirit
Right.
who, if you go to the forest and you leave one cigarette on that rock and you say what you need, you come back and that thing will be on the rock. And I think that's beautiful and amazing. And that shows a reciprocal agreement, right? It's a trade. But you also mentioned that you wouldn't consider that necessarily like a literal pact. Like you would consider that a kind of a trade agreement, right? Kind of like when you sell something to somebody, or when someone buys something from you, or vice versa, that is a reciprocal exchange. But a pact, there's a kind of intimacy with that. Even there's layers of intimacy for sure. There's some pacts that you have that are exceptionally intimate, that can be like spirit marriages, that can involve literal sexual intimacy. There's some spirits that involve that, but like are not as intimate actually emotionally at all. There's some for whom there's a great deal of intimacy in a kind of master apprentice way, or in some ways like they serve you or you serve them. And there's a whole like layer or dimension of experience and emotional transformation and mental transformation in terms of like how the spirit changes you, how an agreement or a sacrifice to a higher power or deity can mold you to become a completely different person, let alone pacts that initiate you, initiatory witchcraft, for example, being just one of many, many ways in which that can happen. But also the hard bargains that spirits drive. It's not just us who are conjuring spirits and like demanding things. Sometimes like they, I think Salt's going to have some interesting stories about that as well, in terms of like, non-consensual initiatory transformations that lead to an implicit and later an explicit pact that is anything if not difficult to bear, certainly, as all three of us have experienced in our lives. So it's one of those things that I think it's good to talk a little bit about. What are the operative ways in which these kinds of agreements work? What are they? Guidance for forming your own? When do you know it's time to have one? What creating that entails if it's on you to create one? And considerations to keep in mind in terms of types of spirits and what pacts can mean to them, levels of intimacy, what entering them entails, and certainly some what not to do type things. And again, this could be frankly a book. This could be several books, but I think it's worth giving a kind of intro episode, and we can obviously expound that into future. But since it was much requested by people on Patreon, by our friends, by various people who've messaged me on Instagram, and certainly plenty of people who have just been wanting content like this already. Much love to Sasha for suggesting that we do this as well. So yeah, I think it'd be a good discussion for the three of us to have. And again, it is meant to be a casual discussion. We'll go into the nitty-gritties of various historical examples in future episodes, because I want to take the time to really dive into that with quotes, with research and everything, and a good bibliography.
Yeah, definitely. And before we get into it further as well, just a upcoming teaser of something that we mentioned in a previous episode. A book club is forthcoming, and one that we're looking at as a candidate text is Cunning Folk and Familiar Spirits from Emma Wilby. So talking in that very scholarly capacity about all these things is something to look out for.
Yeah, I'm excited about the book club. It was also one of those things requested by our Patreon subscribers, and it's one of those things that I think Emma Wilby's book is one of my favorites for sure on the subject, and always worth noting is her research on Isabel Gaudi as well. Because with Isabel, you have a kind of classic case, right, of a deliberate intentional pact to obtain a familiar, right? And not only that, but like you have this typical understanding of, the familiar as a spirit granted to the witch by the devil or by some other power after the soul has been traded or after the soul's been transformed, and so on and so forth, right? And often this is the case that it is intentional in many cases in witchcraft. Sometimes it's not, in the sense that like a familiar was always present and given, but I do like notions of familiar and the wordplay of familial, of passionate, of intimate, of reciprocal feeding, right? In terms of like blood or milk or sex or knowledge or power. Something that I'm also I this is just like completely random, but I've been really interested in notions between this kind of reciprocal feeding that can happen through predation. So for example, there's the Izulu or the Bondulu or the Tecuane, which is sometimes known as a lightning bird, which is a kind of vampiric bird spirit that is a servant of a witch and attacks the witch's enemies, most known among the Zulu tribe in South Africa, but certainly known in other places in South and West Africa alike, where this kind of like lightning bird who manifests through thunder and lightning and so on, and reveals itself as a handsome man to women whom the spirit can seduce and prey on, but also can seduce, his own familiar, bound witch and feed him or her the blood that he has taken from others and so on. So it's one of those things that's like, yes, it's considered an evil creature because it does like the bidding of witches, right? And having this insatiable appetite for blood, but also has this kind of incubus quality, can appear as a giant black bird. Big black bird in my head always makes me think of Damn Fool by Exuma. We're not even at our Akashic record yet, but already Exuma, who is one of my artists for today, all I can think of is the, when she got the Obia power, she's a wound for an hour. Exuma says the word, turn into a big black bird. There you go. Yeah. So it's one of those things of like sometimes part of the feeding isn't just a relationship between you and the familiar, it's the way you mutually empower yourself through doing sorcery and other people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things that we kind of briefly invoked is this kind of mutual capacity, sometimes even being possible because of that exchange of parts of the soul that make this now a necessary component,
Of witchcraft,
like,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So like what happens if something like a part of the appetitive soul is suddenly swapped out for something that needs to be feeding on the blood in this way? And now it's like, okay, now you have to make this agreement with the spirit so that you can both keep yourselves well nourished,
Yeah. Also worth noting is that the Imbundulu can be passed down from mother to daughter. So it could be like, an intergenerational lover that way. Apparently the only known weakness is fire, because the bird cannot be shot or stabbed or poisoned or drowned. But yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. One of my favorite images of the Imbundulu, by the way, is of him, like this black bird riding on the back of a hyena. And because the witch can turn to a hyena, and then the familiar is the bird riding them. So I just love the idea. Like, you often think of like witches riding their familiars to the Sabbat, or being able to like shapeshift or leave their skin behind and ride some animal to there, or have a steed, or be able to like ride farm animals into exhaustion, like we mentioned in our Hagstone episode, right? Some protections against fairies or witches who try and like exhaust your animals and break them through riding them too much. And here you have the example of the reverse, right? Where the witch becomes the steed for the familiar.
I like that a lot.
No, it's great.
Also, reminiscent of, even going out to places like Ethiopia, where you have the witches as well taking the form of hyenas or were-hyenas, as well as blacksmiths for that matter, being able to take the form of hyenas, which I'm sure will come up in a future episode.
we're definitely doing one on the Ethiopian were-hyenas, because we did the were-tigers, right? And I want to continue with the were-animal motif. But one thing that, always good to note, the line between blacksmith and witch is very blurry. And intentionally so in many situations. But yeah, pacts for power, pacts for knowledge, pacts for spirit communion, right? And let's start us off a little bit about what we talk about, what we mean when we discuss the notion of a pact.
There's a lot of different ways you can define it, right? Because on one hand, you have pacts between individuals, you've got pacts between communities of people and one spirit, religious covenants will also fall into that, like with Abraham or Jesus, that kind of example set. But you also have, pacts between individuals and communities of spirits as well. Like
yes.
ingress into a lot of spiritual lineages, for example, you're not just engaging with one spirit, but hey, you now have your main contact or, I guess patron or so on. But you also have a bunch of other spirits who are associated with that spirit who are now, maybe you don't have a direct pact with them, but you have indirect or implicit pacts. Because I think that's another important distinction to make, right? It's like implicit pacts, are they unspoken? Are they kind of, not official? Versus the explicit, is it kind of contracted down? Is it like their terms of agreement that are very plain and clear, right? Because they both have their pros and cons here. Implicit pacts sometimes are all you need. It's probably desirable, especially with spirits who are very firm on what can be done and what can't. Because when it's not in writing, there's a bit of wiggle room, but once it's in writing, they're not going to be so forgivable. But
Yeah,
then
and
at the same time, at least then you know where you stand. Sorry, go on.
yeah. No, it's okay. It's just I was thinking like when you say in writing, this is mostly an oral agreement or an implicit kind of inherited oral agreement, right? Because like when you're born to a particular nome, for example, in ancient Egypt, and like the patron deity of your nome is kind of automatic, right?
Yeah.
Like being born in Hermopolis, like your deity is Jehudi or Thoth. And that kind of thing it's not so much like, oh, I choose my patron deity, Sometimes it's just assigned by virtue of birth, and sometimes it's assigned by virtue of nationality, or by virtue of profession, right? So in terms of like blacksmith gods becoming your patron because you became a blacksmith and your father was a blacksmith, so you didn't have much choice in that career path either. But in this case, I think it's worth noting that, we all inherit matrices of pacts that are entirely involuntary, right? The state is an example of one, what your nationality of your birth, you enter matrices of actual like physical legal pacts in terms of these kinds of agreements, right? And you didn't make one, you didn't consent to it, you didn't consent to any matter of the laws that you entered into society with, but you do benefit from them. You also are punished by them by violating them, no matter what your personal beliefs are about, how just those laws are or how much you personally agree with where your tax money goes. It's one of those things that like, that's a source of constant frustration, right? So in that case, there's plenty of things that ancestrally we inherit. And I think that's one of the benefits of getting readings on ancestral boons as well as curses and problems, right? Is looking at like what is inherited through reincarnation, if that's something that your system subscribes to, through actual lineage to ancestral debts and boons and so on, and also through your personal kind of makeup, I suppose you could say, of your soul. And on the other hand, some things are born through practice, right? Continually working with one herb, because people can work with many herbs in terms of being able to kind of access their virtues, but there are many cultural systems of sorcery in which you don't really have a pact with an herb until you have done a full diet based only on its roots, on its leaves, on its, everything, right? If you've consumed only it in an elimination diet, if you've literally communed with it to a great degree, if you've learned its specific song, so you can summon its virtues even without needing it physically, so you don't need to plant physically in your hands anymore to use it, like it just comes when you call it, you can journey out to receive it and so on. And this notion of journeying, I should mention, or spirit flight or what have you, it's a dangerous practice, right? It's not something to be taken very lightly. When you leave your body in many traditional shamanistic societies, the only reason you're doing that is to trick a spirit, to trap it, to retrieve a part of someone's soul that's been lost, and every time you do, you can get killed. You can never come back to your body. It's always risking your life, even the Zduhachi and the Vetrovnici and everything like that, the kind of weather sorcerers of the Balkans, when they leave their bodies, every time it's a risk that they won't come back. And that if they do come back, it'll be with wounds, with scars. Thinking of old Tis, the Livonian werewolf, right? When he says, he's a hound of God, he goes out to defend his people from witches. There's always a chance he'll lose, right? So it's one of those things, whether it's like Berendanti and Malandanti, or whether it's the Kristik and the Kudlak, and all these kinds of similar motifs, is that when it comes to the spirits that empower you to hunt, to fight, to work, not very pleasant experiences, right? Or the ability to actually say that you have agreement with the animistic spirit of a very particular plant, that it comes when you call it, that it obeys you, that when it's dying, you can make it green again physically. These kinds of things come through intimate firsthand knowledge. You are as much consecrated by use of these spirits, that they use you to heal others or to fight others or to address problems, and that you come when they call you in response to your pact, as much as they come when you call them. So I think the first thing I want to mention is the mutual responsibility, right? That in entering certain intimate relationships with spirits, you owe them your service as much as they owe you. And this is something that can be delineated from the get-go if this is a very voluntary thing where you pledge yourself, kind of like taking monastic vows, right? When you decide to become a monk in a system, like you create a pact with that community and with those gods that you will serve them in a particular way, and you'll give up certain things like alcohol, sex, living a secular life. These are all things that you can give up in certain traditions where you become a monk. And then on the other hand, you gain certain privileges too. And you gain certain abilities to recite certain scriptures, to perform certain blessings, to obtain the authority of the way that you are shaped by that system and made pure by it. You are consecrated through the use of your body as a servant of these spirits, right? So in that way, whether it's involuntary shamanic initiations in which someone is forced to become a shaman, or in which someone is forced to become a witch or an anti-witch, in many systems, you are consecrated through use. These spirits turn you into somebody who is able to work with them by teaching you things, whether you want to or not, and sometimes by killing you or putting you to the point of near death in order to become that kind of person. And so in order to, fray your soul apart, frankly, to the point where it becomes susceptible enough to this transformation. So while not everything is as intense, I think it's worth giving this kind of example first to say that there are lineage pacts, there are involuntary versus voluntary pacts, so we can go into the nitty-gritties of those as well. But it is so much more than a reciprocal trade agreement. There is a mutual use, there is mutual benefit, far more than just who you are as a person and who that spirit is as a person. It's about entering matrices of communal agreements and mutual benefit in that way. As much as, a witch can obtain a familiar from the devil by initiating or by selling her soul immediately and willingly, or is awakens to the fact that she's always had a familiar somewhere in her lineage, in her bloodline. It was passed on by her mother or her grandmother, or it's some kind of familiar that has chosen her from birth and has been around protecting her for a while, but waits until puberty or shortly thereafter to kind of make themselves more known to her. This is a situation in which that familiar knows other spirits too. And there are things that now having a human compatriot in this way can be very useful, whether it comes to offerings, whether it comes to things that person can then do for them physically and mark spaces for them in this world, and ways in which that person can be called on. We've mentioned many times on the show the wild hunt and being forced to go hunt, with wolf spirits and with all kinds of other, creatures and berserkers and avengers. This is something that Key brings up all the time. And I think that it's just another example of what happens when on St. George's Day or on St. Demetrius's Day, you're forced to leave your body and hunt, and you don't get a choice in that. There are ways in which you join the armies of the very spirits that join your spirit army, if you will.
I think as well, one of the key points here is like, we talk about pact, it in itself is a kind of relationship, right, between two or more parties. And when we talk about relationships, there's also a number of different ways that they can be expressed, right? Like relationships between people. When you sign a document for the bank, that's pretty, like we've said, like transactional, it's a quick exchange. But when you swear to follow the precepts of a certain lineage, you swear to maintain these vows, you're going to live on a vegetarian diet, maybe, at least for a certain parts of the year, maybe the rest of your life. There's kind of the expectation that you'll do that. And quite often the spirituals involved in those as well, like in more mundane agreements and relationships. In the case of pacts, I think in particular, like there's just so many different ways that these can be expressed that you mentioned. There's the wild hunt, being forced out your body, being made to eat people, eat spirits necessarily.
Cannibalism isn't just for witchcraft.
Yeah. I mean, what's important in exorcism, right? Like you need celestial soldiers to go and put the demons on the tip of the spear.
As soon as you said putting demons on like the tip of the celestial spear, all I could think about is our friend Red, witchcraftandred.com is her blog, who told us a story a while back about how there was a person who got possessed by a demon who then hopped from one person's body to another and then another, and went all throughout Southeast Asia until the demon went into one last person's body in Singapore, crawled to a Taoist temple and was like, please help me. And then the priest immediately got possessed by Guan Yu, who exorcised the spirit and like liberated it to heaven, and or like wherever I guess the spirit went, but it purified it. But all I could think of was like, yeah, talk about a celestial spear point, right? It's like this priest immediately getting mounted by Guan Yu and being like, okay, it's done.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like sometimes there's just all kind of situations that are going to crop up.
One of the things as well, really to drive the point home, is like necessary matrix of pacts of that very priest within that temple space, within that community, to be able to do this in the first place.
Yeah, and I know that possession can be contentious in mainland China. with regards to various lineages and kind of like how they understand the vehicle of possession by deities or by immortals, and what is technically allowed within the theology. But in this case, in this particular temple, very accepted, and the spirits that claim to be those deities intercede regularly into the lives of people for exorcisms. And I think that's absolutely fascinating, right? It's one of those things of like, as all three of us, without naming necessarily what some of those traditions are, some have been named publicly and some are not going to be named publicly. All three of us exist in traditions that involve mounting and possession in various cultural forms, and sometimes, and for some of us, multiple traditions that involve that. And so if, you are a mount, or if you are designated a mount in those traditions, or you've been verified as a mount in those traditions, what happens by the implicit nature of, that spirit being able to ride you? Or what happens when you agree? It's not just like an involuntary possession, but you agree to that spirit that you can be one of their horses or one of their bodies, that they have been given a body to live in, for example, if they have a physical seat in which they live, and they also have a secondary body, which is not their vessel, which is you, that you are someone that they can ride in moments in which is sometimes seen fit by both of you, but often more on the behalf of the spirit. So, and of course, in terms of like a good mount can, in time learn to negotiate those kinds of things and have a relationship with that spirit in which, ironically, they'll probably possess you less if you become a good diviner because they're able to clarify things just through divination alone. But when they do come in to do works for people, there will be some kind of two-headedness negotiation as well. But yeah, I think these are really great important points. And also, we mentioned like low intimacy versus high intimacy, or the stakes of pacts, right? But I think that it's important to note that, even in environments in which it's more, and by intimacy, I don't necessarily mean emotional intimacy, because some spirits can be kind of distant from you emotionally, but can be some of the most important in your life. And because that is the relationship that they will allow. Not every pact has to be this like extraordinarily emotionally intimate situation. It can be, much as in the way that a teacher that can be the most transformative influence in your entire life can be somebody that you don't necessarily have a personal relationship with. These spirits in some cases, it's not just about emotions, but the intimacy of mutual need and mutual service, or in some ways, a mutual lineage inheritance, right? So one thing I think it's important to note here is that in my personal kind of experience, all pacts are high stakes. By high stakes, I don't necessarily mean that like so intense and demands so much of you. So like we mentioned, going vegetarian is a pact. I actually am an example of that. Like I was a major carnivore before this happened to me, but there's this pact that I entered with a particular spirit in one of my traditions, and the charge that was levied upon me was that I should not eat meat that I do not myself slaughter. So if I hunt an animal myself, or if I kill one for any reason, I am allowed to eat the meat, but otherwise I have to refrain. And as a result, because I don't hunt, I basically haven't really eaten meat in any context outside of ritual in which I was performing the animal sacrifice. And it was necessary for me to consume parts of its flesh. But if someone else were to sacrifice the animal for me, I actually wouldn't be, even on behalf of my spirits, I wouldn't be able to participate in its consumption. It would have to be, my hand would either have to hold their hand while they do it, or I would have to be the one to slaughter the animal, which I've done in some situations, but very rarely has this been necessary. And so it's one of those things that not everything in terms of like low stakes, it's not necessarily about major life changes. I'm talking necessarily about the importance of maintaining these things, even things that appear minor to us. So for example, if the spirit requests or demands, I should say, needs a certain level of commitment from you for this to be considered valid, and this commitment can be very minor, from, for example, a yearly feast celebration, like, oh, from now on, like you need to do this particular feast for me, or a kind of involved offering ritual that's kind of regular. Even if that offering is, let's say, not particularly extravagant, but the regularity is the importance. Missing it can crucially violate some of the terms of the agreements. So like there are certain spirits where like no matter how tired I am, no matter how exhausted I am, no matter how kind of like strung out in that day, I'm gonna go give them their glass of water, no matter what. If I miss certain days of this ritual with them, it's not that they won't forgive me. It's not like they're like, oh my God, I'm so offended. It's more that the offering was less the water and more the commitment, more the agreement that I will do this one token even when I'm tired, because they, for me, will intercess even when they have other things to do. It's not to say that it's a one-to-one reciprocation. Like there's no reason a spirit will intervene for you if you don't make offerings to them. Like we all have intimate spirit pacts of genuine love and camaraderie and brotherhood and so on. And, even romantic love in certain situations in which the spirit will go out of their way to help you regardless of how generous you're being in return, because they care for you. And likewise, you'll go out of your way to help help them, even if they haven't been actively changing too much in your life recently, although they generally always do. It's one of those things where like I love to spoil, the spirits in my life that I know I have the permission to do that with, because some of them you don't want to overfeed, because that can get them kind of the equivalent of kind of fat and complacent, as one of my mentors says. Sometimes you need to put them on a bit of a diet when it comes to offerings, to remind them that like, hey, you don't always work for free for me. I do need you to be actively making my life better and giving me more money. And we mentioned this with the material gathering episode, right? Just last week, it was like, you can't just be asking for these expensive things if you don't want to pitch in for getting them. So you can ask for the expensive taxidermy that you want, but you got to help me get it for cheap, or you got to find somebody to give it to me for free, or put it on the road so that when Key's going to the gym, he sees it on the road and he's like, oh shit, that's the animal that Svinga needs, and puts it in his trunk. So that kind of thing, it's not just about raw reciprocation, but it is the commitment that matters. And some spirits, especially spirits that deeply care about oaths and keeping your promises, are going to levy certain things that they want to see, like, will you actually commit to this? And it's not a matter of just bribing them out of it by giving them extravagant things less frequently. If the point is the frequency, then that is what's mattered. 1 penny given, on the shrine every week, something super minor like that. If it's about a frequency, that is what is crucial, as opposed to, well, I'll give you this, extravagant feast where I'm just going to throw a bunch of money at you, and bribe you that way. It's like, well, was that our agreement, or was the agreement your discipline?
There's an example that I always like to give when kind of talking about the importance of frequency and like the actual delineation of the terms of the agreement, which is, a person can have the most powerful familiar in the world. It's not that guy that I worry about. It's the guy who can like turn a mountain upside down with the ghost of his grandpa for the cost of a candle and a glass of water, because that's so much more indicative of like pacts are actually maintained. Like there's so much more going on behind the scenes here where I'm like, okay, I see what's happening here.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's really important to note, because like some people do the really annoying, like almost like Pokemon game of collect them all with spirits, and it's just like, here's this long resume of saints and angels and various spirits across different cultural traditions that I claim to have pacts with. And like, first of all, how are you maintaining all those? Secondly, like, I understand having shrines to spirits or praying to them and so on, but like, first of all of us could then list the various traditions that we have license or initiation, and then be like, yeah, I could call on these spirits, but like, will I necessarily? There are situations in every system, right, where like you could basically do anything that you need to accomplish with just the main patron that you have in a system. So like your main spirit that's divine for you, or your main familiar in that system, like they could basically do everything, because even if they don't have it in their capacity to leverage certain things, they know people who can. Right. They have agreements. They have pacts of their own with different spirits where they can go out and, not to keep quoting that episode, I'm sorry to keep like in our last episode, but like we mentioned in Materia Gathering, right, that like sometimes the reason the spirit wants something kind of extravagant is not even because they need it. It's, 2 things. One, the journey that you take to obtain that materia opens the worlds that you need. And 2, sometimes they needed to pay off a litany of other spirits that they're trading that thing for. And the end result, once it kind of gets traded 7 times, is the thing that you need. So in that case, the spirit is essentially bartering on your behalf through communities that are not your business to know. This was like ages ago, but we also mentioned like an example of asking your spirits, like, who do you pray to? And so like I mentioned an example of a spirit that I received through Hecate as a kind of like familiar nymph, essentially. And she told me that she prays to the Virgin Mary. And I was expecting her to say Hecate or Selene or something like that, but she said it was the Theotokos. And in that case, I've had Christian spirits, and by that I mean like they were ancestors who were Christian in life, tell me that the last thing they prayed to was a river, and that was the god that they prayed to, because that to them that is as much an expression of the divine Father of all as anything else. And what did I pray to the river for? To ask to take a drink. So it's one of those things that like it's really worth getting to know your spirits on a deeper level of like, what did they understand in their world and their existence as a spirit with their own, I think calling it life is kind of interesting, because we often refer to like life as the state of being alive, as opposed to, dead, especially if they're an ancestor and they're considered to have had a physical human incarnation and now they are disincarnate, or parts of their souls are reincarnated, but parts of them remain. But either way, what I mean is like they have an existence independent of you. They have spirits they can talk to. They have places that are very porous with our own world and that overlap with us. I always love the stories of jinn and fairies and dragons and all these other kinds of classifications of beings that, these classifications themselves being looking quite porous, in which they have their own universities, their own societies, their own libraries, their own judicial halls, where, jinn have their own courts where they get tried in court, and they go to universities where they learn things, in various different kinds of Arabic and, Muslim accounts, is jinn have their own incredibly nuanced societies, and so do fairies, so do dragons, so do many, many, many kinds of spirits in many traditions. And so as a result, like, they're out doing things when they're not talking to you, right? And so they know people who know people. And it's their business to have these relationships. They don't necessarily have to tell you about them. And it's not a sign of trust necessarily, or deepening trust if they do, because it's about, do they have permission to speak about it at all, right? In the way that, like, it doesn't mean that they like you so much if they reveal these things. It just means they have permission to reveal those things. So in that case, when I talk about high stakes being present in all, I saw someone ask low stakes versus high stakes pacts in like a forum. And I was kind of like, I'm not totally sure if I personally conceive of low stakes pacts as a thing. I can see it as like lower needs, right? For example, like, they don't all transform you and are like, from now on you must learn this language, and you must become a vegetarian, you must do these things, or you must never touch this kind of animal again, or you must now wear the color red at all times in your person, but only on these days, that kind of thing.
I was just going to say, with regards to something about the phrasing of like a low stakes and a high stakes pact, I can kind of think of something where it's like, what is the retribution of the spirit upon you if that pact is violated? But that's kind of like aside from the point of like, regardless of what it is, keep your end of the bargain.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that, in some cases, like, what you shouldn't worry about getting into like a war or some kind of curse with a spirit. If you break something like that, that's actually not as common as, I mean, it certainly exists, right? Plenty of folkloric accounts are where a person gets absolutely demolished by a spirit that they offend, or like cases in which, a man marries a fairy but then cheats on her, or something happens, or like the fairy imposes a kind of like very strict pact that involves like certain strong limitations on who they're allowed to sleep with, when and are they allowed physical contact with the sex to which they're attracted, for example, that kind of thing, and then that person absolutely, gets driven mad and so on. Like, certainly that can happen. But with regards to a lot of the kind of agreements that spirits make with magicians and with sorcerers and witches and so on, the main thing to really worry about is your word, right? Because if your spirits can't trust your word when you say, I will make this offering commitment, I will do these things, then how can they trust you when they say, I'll reward you in this way if this were to occur? Tell other spirits that you're sending this petition to that this will be done in their honor, these kinds of things. I have a very, very strict patronage with a particular spirit in the Balkan tradition of witchcraft who is exceptionally ferocious when it comes to oath keeping. We've written about him on the blog. All three of us have a relationship with him, some, kind of like very extreme and some more casual. And that does not rank our pacts over and above each other in any way. We all have sacrificed a great deal for him, and he's done a lot for all of us individually. And this spirit in particular, takes the whole notion of oath breaking very seriously. And oaths here can be implicit, can be explicit, can be verbal, can be nonverbal, but ultimately it is about keeping your word. And what spirits count as keeping your word is not always what we think of. So I've, as a result, personally developed a practice in being very clear orally what I mean and when things are flexible. So for example, like, I'll be very clear when I say I will try to do this versus, this will be done. And also, I will be very clear in terms of amendment clauses, right? So I think a good consideration to keep in mind is like the flexibility that you inherently bring to a spirit relationship. There are sometimes, because of certain chronic illnesses or because of certain needs in your human life, where some things are going to be difficult to do, commitment-wise, time-wise, and so on. So find a way to kind of mitigate that, or find a way to make that accessible to you, in terms of like, I cannot do something regularly, but I can do one thing, monthly, that kind of thing, by every like certain lunar cycle or certain mansion. When the moon enters a certain mansion, that's when I'll do this thing for you, or if it's hard to keep a very standard commitment, that's like your job, for example, is very inflexible or has very random hours, like you get assigned randomly to different places in your job where you can't always predict how free you'll be. You can be like, okay, that it is one day out of the month that I will pick, and you will know it because I'll say this, but I can't promise it'll be the same day every time, but I will do this thing. So it's not to say that like you cannot have spirit relationships if you are, you know what I mean, like suffering from difficult constraints in your job, or if you have a chronic illness, or you have certain kinds of, issues where it's very difficult, which, we all do to various degrees. Certainly as sorcerers, we all have mitigating factors, right? But for some people that can be very prohibitive. And I don't want that to scare anyone off from forming tense relationships with spirits where not only can you call on them to help you in certain ways that otherwise are very difficult to access and on a day-to-day basis. Like if you can't do sorcery on a regular basis for something, it's good to have a spirit constantly kind of keep on task. Like, for example, like a spirit relationship that you have where that spirit is in agreement with you to specifically be on top of your boss at your work. And like that's all they do is like for you, like they mitigate your boss, they deal with the physical land on which you work if you don't work from home, and they essentially juju the people there to find you blameless, to find you exceptionally witty and beautiful and wonderful and always in the right, and to give you less hassle in certain ways. And what you do for them in return, depending on how hectic your schedule is if they agree to it and you're able to mitigate it in a way that your circumstances are still kind of held into account, and that spirit understands kind of your needs and your particular desires in regards to how to keep yourself healthy and sane throughout all of it, that is kind of the thing that you should be workshopping if this is an intentional agreement that you're moving into.
I think as well, one of the important factors to consider is when you do mess up in this respect, like how do you redress that? Because some spirits aren't always going to be happy to redress it in the first place, right? Others, they're going to be more sympathetic. They're going to be willing to listen. They're going to be more understanding. That doesn't necessarily make it better because it's not just that spirit. They're watching us, And that means that pacts aren't just between us and the spirit necessarily, because other spirits are watching us to see how we unlap. Because if we approach them having, basically failed multiple pacts, they're going to be like, not today, man. Fix your shit first.
I'm really glad you raised that point, because it's something that I tried to kind of mention with the whole like matrices of spirit relationships you enter, even through entering a particular pact with one of them. Like having one relationship with, let's say, a fairy spirit, like a vila or a samavila in the Balkan tradition, inherently exposes you, basically the voyeurism of all the vila around you. And they will know, when you screw up, because those are harsh enough as it is, right? I wouldn't necessarily recommend fairy pacts for almost anybody. It's also not something that people necessarily enter into voluntarily, unless you're a very particular kind of witch who has their blood or who has particular predisposed relationships to them. That perhaps it is best if I kind of drop that topic there for now, because it is, a whole can of worms. And lots of people roleplay as it, unfortunately, with that much success. But I would say that it is exceptionally important to know that, as you said, that spirits are watching, and how you honor it is a testament to your character. There are spirits for whom these pacts can be directly confrontational. For example, like a spirit that values it when you practice humility and forgiveness and essentially turning the other cheek, versus a spirit who does not respect you if you do not avenge yourself.
Think about the Goetia, right? Like think about demonic spirits who you subject, you've got them under your foot. But the reason you have them under your foot is because you forced them to swear this oath, right? You've compelled them essentially. And they're bound by that. They're bound by the hierarchy that's reinforcing that oath. If you are the one to break that oath, man, you've just given them a free ticket out. And not only are they now out of it, there's also nothing stopping them from, say,
avenging themselves to you, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're basically, they hate your guts because you've just gone and put your boot down on them, and now they want to take a chunk out of you in return. It's a situation where you kind of have to be very careful in the way, like you said, like you're very careful in the way you word these things, but you have to be, especially if you want these kind of agreements to last a long time. And like I said, some spirits, they're forgiven, but we need to think about how this is going to reflect on us in relation to these other spirits, and we need to think about really what's good conduct in respect to spirits in general, because that's why it's an issue, right? It's not just about breaking oaths and lies. It's also about specifically carrying oneself appropriately, having the demeanor of a practitioner in the most literal sense, not as a kind of, aesthetic or identity, but in one's actions. It's orthopraxy.
Yeah, absolutely. This is so much more than just kind of flexing on social media or to other people. Like, look, I'm such a witchy person, look at me and my beautiful shrines. It's about the kind of conduct that you carry. Like when you enter certain forests and certain spaces and certain crossroads, do the spirits there, or even in spirit flight, do spirits recognize you by the badge of, frankly, merits that you wear in terms of how you've maintained your relationships, right? People often mention that in like interpersonal psychology, boundaries are not something that you force on people. It's something that you enforce for yourself. Like if you do this to me, I will no longer socialize with you. I will no longer let you have access to me, because this is a boundary that I've drawn for myself. I can't force you to behave by my standards, but I can remove myself from your circle if that's how you're gonna carry your behavior out around me. And that way, I think it's also important to note that that very much applies to not tolerating certain things that you don't want to put up with regards to, you know, situations with spirits, but also ensuring that you're not doing them dirty. We're talking mostly about like voluntary kind of like pacts that you enter into willingly and intentionally, right? You know, so for example, you are cultivating a relationship with a particular spirit. You spent, let's say, 3, you know, years working with them and praying to them and kind of experiencing that they have a relationship with you where they're able to consistently manifest results in your life in a way that really works. And you have a decent offering practice with them, and you want to kind of take it to the next level. And you say, I want a patronage from you. Like, I want you to teach me to be personally invested in my progress, to favor me above others, you know, to treat me with a certain level of generosity and respect, because you've seen what I can do, and you've seen that I'm hungry for power, I'm hungry for knowledge, I want to learn your secrets. Like, the way that you personally do magic appeals to me. This was the start of many things with Saint Cyprian and Saint Justina and myself, you know, but that's kind of thing. It's just like, I want to learn your magic, and I want to learn it from you directly, and I want you to favor me. And these kinds of situations, when you enter them and you say like, go out of your way for me, I'm going to go out of my way for you. This is something that, especially if you've had experience with the spirit already, and you know, you kind of know a little bit more of what you're getting into, you know, put me on a path by which I can learn more about you, by which you can reveal more of yourself to me through human disciples who are currently incarnated, through spirit disciples, you know, who are training with you in your vast library of knowledge, who you sent to me in my dreams, and so on and so forth. These kinds of things I think are very important. These kinds of clauses, when you look into the mutual benefits that spirit receives in terms of not just offerings, but acknowledgement, promotion, gaining an access into new matrices of agreements for themselves. When we are as varied in our interests as we are, because all of us are initiated into quite a few things and are also genuinely deeply rooted in those practices. Like, this is not just a matter of collecting certifications and you know, titles to kind of flex in a resume, right? And these are things that we happen to be drawn to equally, and we want to deeply study those things. It's one of the reasons why all 3 of us have mentioned learning languages of traditions of cultures that we were not born into. It's one thing with like Serbian being my first language and, you know, Balkan witchcraft being one of my main practices. It's another thing for like learning Portuguese, you know, for Brazilian Kimanda, or learning other languages for other traditions that I'm also involved in that I don't want to be as public about. In that case, I think it's exceptionally important to note that this is a relationship in which they are now, through the virtue of the many spirits that you're also in contact with, gonna create alliances between members of your court, between other pacts that you have, in order to better facilitate working with them. Especially like when you set several spirits onto one task, or you go to your shrines and you're like, okay, this is what I need done. Who here volunteers to work for it? And you see several spirits not cooperating, like they're gonna create their own matrices through you. So there is a mutuality there. And I think it's exceptionally important as a consideration to keep in mind, that we're not just talking about offering schedules and delineating terms. Like, what is more important to that spirit? Is it the quality of the offering? Is it the regularity of it? Is it the oral praise that you give them? Is it introducing other people to them? Is it you being silent about them forever and never acknowledging that you have a relationship with them, but you do research them extensively and work with them very intimately in certain ways? And the silence and the secrecy and the never mentioning that you even work with them in the first place, even when others in your social group talk about them constantly around you and you have to pretend that you don't work with them. A real story. You know, that this is something that's really important to them, because they want to know that you're not after any reputation involved with having to pack with them. You are after this kind of passionate, ecstatic witchcraft communion with them directly. Yeah, again, true story. But these kinds of things, you know, delineate what is important here, because we're referring to pacts here as not just agreements, right, but as mutually changing and transformative on an alchemical and some way soul level, right? You know, especially when it comes to initiatic pacts, agreements that are not necessary for good spirit work. You can absolutely just have an agreement to be like, hey, and I'm sure, you know, linguistically speaking, we can refer to this as pact. I'm not a particularly stern person when it comes to definitions. Absolutely, you can say like, oh yeah, the spirit merchant that he puts a cigarette to, and they give him whatever he wants in return in exchange for that tobacco. Like, there's a kind of pact implicitly there. It's okay if we just refer to that as an agreement, and because these are synonyms too, right? You know what I mean? But we're kind of referring to a very particular way in which alchemically, spiritually, the agreement between the individuals is a mutually binding situation. It's kind of like how exorcism is very similar to conjuration. These are 2 sides of the same coin. You know, I think pact and transformation kind of the mutual exchange of ideas, almost like a cultural immigration that occurs on both ends, is transformative, right? And is something that develops each person in a new direction. It almost like coheres the various spider webs of fate and kind of guide you in a certain way, like in Neoplatonic theurgy, right? The deity that you attach yourself to their car, right? As they go through the sky, as they orbit the planets, or like that does change you, and it changes your afterlife destination. Like where do you go? It's one of the reasons why people gain the familiars in the PGM, right? One of the things that several of like the main kind of PGM spells that involve deifying the falcon and milk, for example, what you get is a spirit that advocates for you, brings you close to the gods, and that when you die, your soul does not go to the place where most people's souls go. It goes to a realm closer to the divine because of the pact that you made with the spirit, right? And the authority that it confers upon you, to the point that there's some like interesting Egyptian mystery cult kind of comparisons with like the way that the person becomes deified by way of a pharaoh, essentially, in this process.
I have to admit, I'm kind of just visualizing Plato telling us to attach our ethereal vehicle to the Ferrari of Ares.
I know, it's like the whole solar bark versus like the car of the planets. I think they should do like a planetary grimoire of like which car type is associated with which. I mean, we all know I'm a Subaru girl, right? I love Pleiades.
The old car brand, I don't even know if it's still in production, but the Saturn.
Yeah. It was so
Chronos
slow.
and the whip.
But it goes so good. Powered by piglets. I was just thinking about offering schedules and the fact that like Salt and I joke about me imposing the girlfriend tax upon him, where he'll be like, "Hey babe, I'm gonna have fries. Do you want some?" And I'll be like, "No." And then as soon as he has them, I'll be like, "I want 5." And he has to give them to me. Okay, that's part of the pact of our relationship. Like he has to submit to my girlfriend tax, in which like I will have a part of his garlic bread or a part of whatever he's having because I want it. And that's sufficient enough.
And that's why you ordered 2 fries.
Yeah, actually is why. Even if I say no, he does get 2 fries on the Uber Eats because he knows I'm gonna regret saying no when I see them and I smell them.
And spirit packs work the exact same way, folks. Make sure to double up when you can.
Also, what happens when on the subject of debt, paying your debts and in some ways paying off debts ahead of time is an interesting practice in several cultural traditions of like kind of way ahead before you make the transgression. You already kind of put in kind of like the extra tax to ensure things are okay. Again, this depends on what the spirit wants. I like to call it the reasonability versus the ambition clause. We are all exceptionally ambitious people. We crave power and we want extremely potent and verifiable sorcerer's results. Like that's something that brought the 3 of us together as best friends, is truly, and this is frankly that brought me and Salt together as partners. The fact that we just love watching magic work, like, and we crave that. Like we crave deeper communion with spirits. We crave being able to be in more loving and reciprocal relationships with them. We crave that kind of familial experience that we have with a lot of our spirits, in which they are as much family to us as our ancestors, and in some cases even more deeply so in the case of witchcraft. And we crave to do right by them. We crave to love them in return and to do right by them. And as a result, when it comes to wanting miracles, wanting spirit relationships that don't just nourish us on a good physical level, in the sense of like they provide for us, they enhance our lives and make them more, amusing and fun and interesting, entertaining and adventurous, and bring us closer to learning other kinds of magics and initiate to other kinds of systems that we're interested in and make us adventurous in that way. But also we get to walk that path with them, right? Like that it's worth it, not just because of our personal desires, but because we get to do it with these spirits. Like we wouldn't want to do it with other random spirits. Like we wanted to do it with these spirits that we're so passionate about walking alongside. In that case, I think it's really important to note with them your ambition and their ambition for what they want from you versus the responsibility and the reasonability of what you can attain. So on the one hand, I recommend always being extremely ambitious with what you want, but then look at what you can do. This is a story I think back to often, where someone that I know was basically frustrated with one of their spirits, and they were like, "I don't understand. Like I really want you to do this major thing for me that is really important, and I know it's within your realm to be able to do. Divination has confirmed that you're capable of doing it. So I know it's not it's not unreasonable to ask this of you. It's not just that you're a powerful spirit, it's that, you've done this for others. Like this is not a spirit that is a personal familiar to them, right? Like they know of this spirit's reputation with others. And they were like, well, how come it's not happening when I asked for it? And the spirit was like, when have you ever asked me what those other people did? And not in a pure like one-to-one reciprocation way of like oh well, you didn't put in enough for me to want to do it for you, like I need to be bribed more, because some spirit relationships absolutely include bribery. In this case, that's not what that spirit was trying to indicate. They were saying like, One of those people that you mentioned built a temple to me, like a minor temple that publicly is visited right now in our country. One of those other people genuinely went out of their way to proselytize me and bring me into contact with other people that I can now heal and work with. One of those other people is a foreigner who came to this country on a language exchange program, learned this language just in order to essentially conduct ethnographic interviews with worshippers and then get closer to me in this way and promote me through their PhD research. Like, what are you doing? Like these, and note the things that all three of these situations have in common, right? It's spreading that spirit's influence, allowing them to reach more people and to help more people. It's not just the spirit's vanity of wanting to be worshipped, it's the ability for it to intercess in other people, to allow their, cult, essentially, as a folk saint to grow outside of the tradition of their hometown, essentially, in which this tradition first arose, and to become a more global phenomenon. Much in the way that various folk saints went from, let's say, being kind of minor figure within their country or their town or their village, and into rapidly becoming something where people all over the world buy their candles and their merch and everything like that. So in this case, like, that indicates the spirit wants to spread and wants to be able to help more people and wants to be able to reach more believers, and almost in a Photomechas type way duplicate. And so I think in this case, it's good to know is like, what are you doing in return? And not, again, I want to stress, this is not in a pure way of like, I give you this amount of money, you do this kind of thing for me. I'm talking in terms of devotion, in terms of seriousness of commitment. You want a committed transformation in your life from the spirit. What are you doing to allow ingress from their power into your life? What are you doing to make the environment around you, not just in terms of like how you live, but in terms of like your social life, your soul, your kind of like mind, to allow for that spirit to ingress further?
I think this really, really just emphasizes again the importance of what right conduct looks like to a given spirit that goes above and beyond what would be, in some cases, explicitly positioned within the framework of the given pact that you have with them. Like, to actually express the love or respect or adoration or what have you to the spirit by going out of your way. Like, you kind of mentioned these examples of like, okay, this person dedicated their entire life to that spirit. This person became functionally a priest of that spirit by creating a space in which they are publicly spread and worshiped. And within the responsibility clause versus the ambition clause framework that we were discussing earlier, this can be kind of what the ambition half of that looks like.
I think as well, we can kind of compare it to parental relationships or even relationships an individual has to the state, in that there's kind of obligations there, whether stated or unstated, that even if those obligations are met, there's sometimes more needs, right? Like, a parent has the responsibility at the most basic level to feed their child, to love their child, take care of them. But then what about other obligations, right? Like, oh, do you take your child to his soccer games? That kind of level where it's not really a necessity, but sometimes, if you want your kid to be good at football, you want to take him to his football game, right? With these relationships, it's not an exchange per se. It's more so, where does this lead? Like, where does this activity lead? Where does this take the relationship? How does it change the dynamic that's going to be going on? Like, you don't have to give offerings every single day, but assuming it's appropriate to do so, it's going to help out a lot more in terms of, how that spirit conducts its business, how it goes about its work, especially when it's a spirit who kind of needs that support, right? Like, I'm less so thinking of gods and so on who have no needs really, and more so ghosts and stuff, right? Like, if you're working deeply with ghosts or yin spirits of most kinds, then all those offerings, all that incense, it's really helping. And if you do that daily, not saying you should, but maybe there's a context where it's necessary, then that spirit's going to be a lot more capable. It's going to be a lot more nourished, so to speak. And in turn, there's a mutual nourishment. It's not a transaction. It's not an exchange. It's just the dynamic of the relationship has culminated to that position, I suppose we could say.
Yeah, especially like there's times when like that might be necessary briefly. For example, like a 9-day elevation of a spirit, right? You would be doing regular water offerings during a time, but then afterwards you don't need to anymore. And you would establish a more kind of like regular schedule that isn't as frequent. But there's other times when like you need to help a spirit work off certain merits or accumulate certain kinds of deeds to help them in their journey and so on, depending on the system in which you are, right?
If you're taught how to heal and kill by a spirit, right, and then you go around butchering everyone in the village, now all that murder is not just on you, right? It's on the spirit as well.
Yeah,
It's reflected
yeah.
back on him. So there's a cause and effect going on there.
Yeah. So earning favor with your spirits, I think, is also important. I mentioned like maybe spending a year to 3 years before you decide to enter a more ambitious sort of patronage of the spirit. I think that kind of thing of like, one thing is identifying natural patrons, right? Which is a divination that can absolutely be performed for people. Something that all of us really can offer in certain degrees. But another thing is looking at not assuming that there are natural patronages simply by virtue of existence, but also looking at what is there through practice. Like, who are the ancestors of your work in terms of like human ancestors who pioneered your particular trade, but also in terms of spirits that patron what you do. In some ways, like, there's a fertile bound for you to access that spirit more deeply because you already practice what they favor. There's certain spirits for whom I've learned to play instruments for them because that's something that they really love, and that was not necessarily a condition of us getting closer, but it's something that I really want to do for them because I noticed that was a particular kind of music that they enjoy hearing, right? And also, I think in that way, when it comes to earning favor with spirits, it's not just about impressing them on a raw level of like, look at how dedicated I can be to do certain things for you. It's also a matter of showing that you are the kind of person they can trust to be honorable. We mentioned that before with keeping your word, but like, you are getting along with them that way. So you also then are not going to be bound by agreements that are contradictory. We mentioned that before, like, what if a spirit like really would prefer you to turn the other cheek in situations, and that would show them that you have a certain kind of restraint that they admire, versus a spirit that wants you to avenge yourself and will not respect you if you do turn the other cheek, right? It's making sure that you have relationships with spirits that are, on the one hand, complementary, and on the other hand, that balance you out, right? So I certainly have spirits that are quite aggressive. I think as a witch, that's kind of natural, but very, very aggressive and very prone to the kind of usual, let's say, that the horrors of that accompany witchcraft, right? The cannibalism, the blood sucking, all that good stuff, right? They have that imagery deeply invested in their paths. Those are the nightmares that they give me, and they expect a kind of ruthlessness from me with regards to certain things. On the other hand, I also have other aspects of my spirit court that advocate for a certain level of moderation, restraint, not necessarily just in terms of behavior, but in terms of kind of the vows that I particularly make to the spirits that I'm loyal to, in terms of the kind of person that I want to be independently of what my spirits think. And also the fact that I trust them to guide me, as well, and have my best interest at heart is inherent in some relationships and not in others. There are some spirits that empower me greatly, but I will always veto their decisions through another spirit who I'm in some ways is far more responsible for my personal well-being, my personal growth. So in that case, like, having a certain relationship with, like, let's say, a major spirit that is like your chief guardian or your chief instructor, your patron, the one who kind of rules your destiny, is really helpful because they can be the one that arbitrates conflicts. They can be the one that be like, I personally advise this path. So in that case, and because the main spirit that does that for me is, in many ways a wisdom deity, is something that I feel really comfortable listening to him and confiding in him, not just in terms of resources and in terms of kind of like my own philosophical upbringing, but also in knowing how to deal with the intense urges and transformative experiences of witchcraft that involves truly kind of guttural and visceral experiences, as well as moderating the everyday needs of having a incarnate human existence. Regardless of the state of our souls, we are all living a human life. And so as a result, it's like, what does it mean to kind of integrate and have a successful experience in that way that does not alienate us from people and ensures that we are loyal, kind, compassionate people to basically not just our spirits, but to the people that we care about. And so as a result, I think it's really important to note, having the moderating ability between spirits is good. And that also involves some necessary ranking of, priorities, because it's not just about blindly following one spirit over another. It's having the understanding of who is responsible to your growth as a person, and what does that growth mean. Do you agree and consent to sort of like the path that is shaping, like, why do you understand on some level why you're being molded into certain things? Because for many of us, in terms of a lot of our traditions, like, we don't really get a choice. That's something that is predetermined, or our spirits shape us into that. I was talking with somebody who's a shaman in a traditional society, and her being a shaman was like not only determined prior to being born through birth omens in her tribe, but it was also something that other people had, and out of, let's say, 10 people, only 2 eventually apprenticed and passed initiatory tests and so on, and survived, frankly, like literally survived and lived through what happened to them when they inherited their spirits who were put in their bodies and who trained them and so on. And she was saying, like, she sees a minimum of 10 clients a day every day for her whole life, not just for her tribe, but for other peoples who travel to come see her. And one thing that she mentioned was like, none of that was her choice. And she was saying, you're lucky if you're not a shaman in my culture, because that means you don't have to do all this shit. You can do other kinds of magic. You can do magic for yourself. You can just study things. Like, that does not mean that this is the only route to become a spiritual person. But she sees herself as a servant of her gods, and she has to do this for her community. She's this intercessor, and that's what she was forced to be by her spirits, you know? So in case of involuntary things like that, you are being shaped in a particular way as, frankly, you know, to quote her, a tool for your spirits, right? You know, and for the spirits of your community. And in other ways, you know, when it's a bit more voluntary, you understand, you know, where you are being shaped. Does it coincide with also what you want for yourself? What happens when spirits want you to ordain in certain systems? You can always say no. You could be like, I can't be a priest in that. But that also means you can't go further with them in certain routes. Or alternatively, you can say, actually, I'm totally down for that, but I need to do it in a way in which I can keep other obligations, because some things would cancel each other out. Like, I can't ordain a system that is completely anti-animal sacrifice, because several of the main traditions that I practice absolutely offer to spirits in that way. So I can't enter a system that is, you know, theologically against that. On the other hand, could I practice a system that involves none of that as long as it's kept separate? Of course. Salt and I have actually, we live together, so we had to find a way to keep our shrines separate. For some of his spirits that are strictly no blood, they cannot be around the spirits of mine that receive blood.
Yeah, and there's also cases where, you know, you don't get to say no at all to the spirits when they ask for that, right? Like, when they really push for you to get involved in this practice, the situation comes to be that you can maybe negotiate, hey, I can't do the community stuff. I can at least give you personal offerings and you protect my family, but that's all I'm doing. But sometimes it's straight up, yeah, we're just gonna rack you with sickness till you do it. It's
Are you talking about what I'm thinking of? Because I know we're gonna do an episode on this coming up soon, but like Chumashen, where like the medium is basically forced into a life of service to spirits, and prevented from having like a normative job as well.
yeah, in a lot of cases, like there's some cases, especially, I mean, usually to be fair, because they're pretty, you know, they're amenable, but there are more extreme cases as well. I think we've all heard of those where this is what you have to do. No, you don't get a choice in it. And, you know, to the modern American mind, that's horrifying because free will is just like, okay, but human free will is not
Says the Brit.
necessarily the strongest force in the universe. And spirits will definitely outlast it. But yeah, in respect to the particular tradition we were discussing, they're usually amenable, and usually actually the solution is specifically, like I was saying, like to enshrine them and pay personal veneration, but not necessarily engage in a communal action, because what these spirits usually want from people in this particular case is they want to go out, they want you to essentially make them famous, make them well known, and help them attain merit through that. Because if they're well known, then they can do works for people. People will pray to them, approach them, and say, "Hey, could you help me?" And then they can have merit and attain promotions and so on. But that's the thing, like spirit motivations in looking for these packs are always going to vary. I think that's also something we want to consider here is like, why is the spirit looking for this pack? Because earlier on, we've mentioned spirits who are emotionally close to us. You know, maybe there's a deep relationship there, whether it's familial, romantic, or even just friendship, right? Peers, or, you know, we could even look at patronage spirits, right? Are these spirits the patrons of this craft just because of the actions? Is there some kind of familiarity or participation in that? You know, if you're working as a scribe or a thief or even an athlete who does running, for example, then maybe Hermes is going to naturally, maybe he's someone you participate in just through your daily actions and the direction that your soul's moved along.
Oh, you work at
But
a
then
post office?
Yeah, yeah. Or you know, bank truck guard, that kind of thing. But like, there's also other cases, right, where there's other spirits, like I think saints would be a good example of this. It's not necessarily as much about participation as kind of shared kinship, lineage, even. Like, hey, I am a spirit who participated in the origin of this industry, or I was there to support it in its founding days. And I like seeing this passed on. This is my legacy. This is something that I helped establish, and now I like helping people pursue this because it's important to me as a spirit to see that it's perpetuated, that it's continued. I think this is especially the case, you know, a lot of traditional industries where people have a choice, right, between doing things the traditional way or things where, you know, you have a lot of machinery involved. One really pressing example of that is, for example, ink making in East Asia, where people go to a lot of effort to make ink sticks the way that their ancestors did. But the vast majority of sales are still, it's machine-made ink. So who's happy with that? Probably his ancestors. He's like, okay, we spent this time passing on this craft to our children. I want to see them use that. So I think there's a lot of avenues and a lot of motivations that spirits can have when they enter into these agreements. And I think we need to take that into consideration, especially because that's going to shape a lot of things in terms of the direction that things take. And it's not necessarily the only force. Our own intention is going to be a driving factor as well. But let's be real. The vast majority of spirits people are agreeing with aren't devils and diabolic spirits they bound up. It's not unpleasant alliances or begrudging things, and it's not the transactional agreements that have become more and more common in the popular imagination, but frankly, I find are quite uncommon in reality. I think really the vast majority of pacts are kind of, even if not necessarily emotionally close, depending, I think that's quite often for a few limited spirits who are very deeply close to us. But I think there's always a kind of sincerity and proximity and hoping to attain some degree of closeness and understanding mutually. So kind of knowing what underlies all of that is key.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I just want to bring up again, like even sometimes the participation in a particular craft or trade or profession consecrating you in some ways already to this particular thing. Or not necessarily consecration, but you participate in their essence, sometimes evolves into spreading that pact through just its raw popularity in a given place to the place itself, and creates this kind of feedback loop of like, okay, you have entered into this pact now just by virtue of being in this place. Just one of the examples I've been thinking a lot about in preparation for this episode is like Saint Nicholas.
Yeah.
Especially in like kind of the Netherlands and Low Countries and northern Germany and things like that,
and Croatia,
where in along these areas, historical estimates would be like 9 and 10 people are fishermen or sailors or doing trade by sea. So naturally, the patron of this entire place is going to become the seafaring deity. So now everyone being born into its participation in this place is creating this feedback and matrix of pacts.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's a great interplay between historic professions, practiced on a particular land, coppersmithing in Cyprus, for example, and Aphrodite being a huge one that we'll talk about. I'm sure in the coming months as we finish many of the things that we're making for her, but also in terms of just kind of like experiencing the actual ancestral change of like the lineage of how do people feed themselves, right? And what are the spirits that support them? And how do people and spirits, alike live and toil in the same land and nourish each other, right? That to me is the heart of a lot of animistic interactions, right? It's the heart of the agricultural year in farming communities. It's the heart of lunar mansion astrology, for example, with keeping time with the phases and the fertility cycles of your land. It's the heart of the saint calendar. And really, I think in that case, one kind of final note to really make is, besides, paying off your debts and offering schedules and all those things, is like when not to make a pact, when to keep things kind of at a more kind of regular business transaction. Because again, like I don't mean to be a stickler for definitions, because I truly don't really particularly, I'm not interested in arguing semantics at all. And I'm extremely flexible on every definition. Like if I see something that works better and that is actively used by communities in a better way, then I'll just adopt that. I have no particular desire to be stubborn about anything when it comes to linguistics, right? Language is evolving, and it's more important to see how people living in traditional societies that are actually doing this kind of stuff actually talk about spirit pacts. This is purely just in my experience and in the traditions that I'm involved with. Making a pact with a spirit necessitates a certain kind of transformation on both sides that is not present in mere reciprocal agreements, right? And in this case, even if a pact and a reciprocal agreement can be kind of like synonymous in many ways, right? Now, in this case, when not to make one, I think number one, we mentioned, all three of us kind of brought this up several times, it's when you can't abide by the terms, right? Which is nothing wrong with that. If you're like, hey, I don't want to become become this thing. You could try and force me to be that, but I will try and resist it, you know, and especially when some spirits don't really take no for an answer very well when it comes to these kinds of things. And, so, you know, are prone to drive people mad if they try to do so. You could be like, no, I'm going to defend myself, you know, with my spirits and stuff like that. I'm good, you know, thanks. And not that it's always possible, especially with certain spirits. We mentioned fairies a few times, but like they're pretty known, especially where I'm from. So just straight up be like, nope, too bad. I cast level 5 madness on you now. And the person ends up quite in the predicament in terms of if a fairy wants to adopt them and make them into their sister or their daughter and so on. I'm thinking especially of the Padalica and the Shlemanke, at least in Serbia. But on the other hand, you know, you also have situations kind of like in the Chimechan example, right? Northern Chinese spiritism, in which sometimes people become a medium by force. But if you can't abide by the terms, there is no reason to enforce them upon yourself. And if it's just not acceptable to you, or if it's contradictory to, if you do have that ability to negotiate it, you know, absolutely. On the other hand, you know, if you can't maintain them for the duration of the pact, if you're not in a point in your lifestyle and in what you're doing where you can maintain certain necessities that the spirit requires of you, perfectly reasonable to do it in the future. And that also applies for situations in which you cannot promise a spirit something like that, you know, in terms of crowning or priesthood, or you can promise certain kinds of priesthoods to certain kinds of spirits, but not other kinds, right? You know, so I think it's important to be reasonable and also just kind of assess what you're able to really promise, you know, because again, maybe this is the Master Wolves bias in me, but I do think that, you know, your word is your bond. Can you make promises and can you keep them? That doesn't mean you can't amend them. That doesn't mean if I promise, let's say, Key, and I say, hey, I'm going to do this reading for you next week. And if work is really intense and I have too much going on and I really can't make the time to do the reading that I promised him, there's no reason why I can't just say, hey, slight change of plans, like I need to postpone it by 3 days because my boss has a deadline for me that I really can't negotiate right now. I could negotiate it if I ensorcelled him more. You know. I had to be an asshole for a second because I was like, oh, is this example truly authentic? Because, you know, I'm built different.
Because I don't give a shit.
I was supposed to save Dracula flu for a vampire episode. I can't help it, man.
This shit ain't nothing to me, man.
Anyway, you gotta flex the sorcery muscles for a second, you know. But let's say you're in a situation, right? You know, then of course it would be understandable, right? You know, we're friends, we have an established rapport. He's not gonna hold that over my head. That's because we have an established relationship, right? Where it's not like I'm gonna be disappointing him and he'll understand what's going on. So that's what it's kind of like the classic case of like, if a stranger comes off the street and it's like, can I have $200, please? I'll be like, no, I'm sorry, I can't just give you that, you know. But if my best friend were to be like, I need $200, please, I'll be like, it's already set to your PayPal. In that case, it's important to know rapport. But on the other hand, I think, you know, your word is your bond. Like, you know, the established trust of like, I'm not just trying to screw you over, like I truly cannot accomplish this, is like let spirits know ahead of time. One of my favorite practices, besides telling the bees, which I've mentioned a few times, is telling your house spirit, okay? Just like there's so many situations in which you tell your house spirit, my friend is coming over. It's this person's birthday. We're celebrating the same feast, you know? And even in the situations, the very same ones in which you cannot thank them, it's like kind of a taboo to say thank you to your spirit or to say this is for you. You know, you just kind of leave the milk, cream out and butter and toast like completely silently. You know, you say, hey, friend's coming over, we're celebrating this person's birthday, I'm leaving for now. And then you tell them ahead of time, you know, hey, I'll be gone for a little while, so I can't actually make these offerings to you. I'm going to leave a bunch out now, and I'll see you in 2 weeks, you know, when I'm back from traveling. That kind of thing. Or, for example, shrines, when I'm traveling and I'm like, hey, no one's supposed to really interact with you guys, but I've told Salt to leave a bowl of water here. You can share this, okay? Like, he can't do more for you, but he's going to do this one thing, take that as a token for while I'm gone. And while I'm traveling, at certain tombs, at certain crossroads, at certain kind of areas that are chthonic, I'm going to say a certain prayer to you under my breath. No one that I'm traveling with will even notice that I'm doing this. And just know that, you know, I'm making good on my thing, or I'm going to leave my spirit. I'm going to leave my body behind in my spirit form, and I'm going to do something for you. And in that case, you know, just so many ways around these kinds of things, depending on the skills developed. So I would say, you know, just make sure that agreements made are agreements kept and that you understand the time duration for them, because not everything has to be for your incarnation or for your life. For a lot of things, because of certain initiations and certain kinds of witchcraft pacts, they are much more than this life. They are recurring and they are lineage, not just like passed down like a familiar through mother to daughter, but like passed down the familiar to yourself across incarnations. But there you have it. I think these are some good kind of ground rules to think about. And I truly want to emphasize, because we'll go into many historical examples in future episodes, we're going to kind of extract some like lessons out of them, not just talk about like, what happened in these situations, but also kind of like what are the lessons we can learn as, sorcerers and witches in terms of good spirit animist practices. But I think that for now, it's just good to kind of note the importance of having integrity in spirit relationships that are not just based on you being a servant to spirits, but based on you being an agent, right? You being a sorcerer or a witch who's able to empower yourself, whether your approach is one more of sorcery, command and authority through, learning traditions and learning sorcery techniques, or through witchcraft of transformation and becoming one with the spirits and becoming more like them. And, alliances through familial relationships in that case, through commanding spirits because of who your spirits are and also who you become by virtue of your initiation. In that case, whatever your approach is, I think it's important to note the vital importance of keeping essentially true to your integrity. And even if you don't always know 100% where you're going, and don't have everything mapped out, nor should any of you really. I think it's more about being able to show your character and that you are not someone who bends or is swayed easily. The relationships you want to develop, you're serious about. This is not a passing fad or interest. This is something that you want to sacrifice for and really cultivate true piety towards. Even if it's frankly just for power, for ambition, it's because you also want to do right by those spirits who are passing those things on to you. Like when you initiate the tradition, that you want to do right by those ancestors who struggled and who suffered to bring this tradition to you in an accessible form in the modern day, through the internet and through translations and so on, that you're willing to go the extra mile for them, and not just in terms of offerings, but in terms of showing up, learning from your initiators, giving respect to them and their families, respect to the property in which they live, that they host you, and respect for the lineage by learning the languages and by immersing yourself in those cultural paradigms. So I think that's a good place to start for now, because we'll definitely expand on this very much in the future. But gentlemen, it's been a pleasure.
It's been real. Thank you very much for popping off today.
Oh, thank you. I just love this stuff so much, and I love my spirits so much. And honestly, even just doing this podcast is a way for me to, even when I can't name them at all, is to, in my head, I'm naming certain people that I care very much in my spirit court who have transformed me and motivated me to become just a more holistic version of myself and a more ambitious person in terms of just aggressively pursuing good results in my magic and to be adventurous and free and absolutely in love with the animist beauty of this world, of the sheer diversity of spirits and the sheer overwhelming, it reduces me to tears sometimes, frankly, love that I have, not just for my spirits, but for the existence of magic and spirits and the existence of ways of communion with them. Like I am every day humbled with joy that this is real and that I get to live in a world in which I get to talk to all these incredible beings that I am so deeply humbled that they're with me and that they walk with me and that they've taken an interest in transforming me and nurturing not just my magic, but my life, my integrity, my desires, my intellect, my sincere devotion to them has been crafted through so much gratitude. And so it really means a lot to me to be able to, whether it's the clients that I divine for with Guiding Command, or whether it's the people I know for you, Key, the people that you coach and learning to hear and see their spirits so they can make these kinds of pacts, so they can have your advice and personal one-on-one coaching and how to actually maintain healthy relationships with them and be able to perceive them and be able to make better understandings of them, because you teach a killer course on a one-on-one mediumship with the people that take you on as in coaching, right? Well, it's the people that Salt guides through his astrology and through his incredible advice, where he looks into the heart of not just their chart, but of the kind of spiritual makeup of their ancestry, of the pacts that they inherently have, and those that they would be really welcome to cultivate in terms of understanding the positions of the stars in their lives, the very pact that was entered into by being the virtue of being born with the stars. I think it's all three of us are very passionate about this idea. So I'm glad I was able to kind of lead discussion a little bit today.
The coaching and spirit site is primarily done out of trying to show other people what is possible and allow them to participate in the same joy and bliss and the knowledge that magic is ontologically real.
Amen, brother.
Yeah.
I transformed into my other spirit form, which is Hulk Hogan briefly. And that's what I became when I cracked the eggs in my mouth, by the way. Okay, we've come full circle. And with that, our Akashic record. Soap and skin being the devil. is mine because it slaps. And I promised some Exuma. I was trying to like think of like there's so many good Exuma songs, right? Dambala, 13th Sunday, Exuma the Obia Man. I'm gonna go with Mama Lai Papa Lai because it is not only my favorite song from him, but out of the whole album, Exuma the Obia Man, that one, it sings to the initiation into Obia, it sings to pacts with many spirits best left unnamed out loud because we're recording at dark right now. And truly, absolutely love that song and love the sheer passion portrayed in this horrific and hauntingly beautiful initiatic experience, you know, where he saw the fire in the dead man's eye.
Perfect song. Perfect album. We'll always plug it for this podcast. If there's one true Akashic record.
Yeah. If there's like one Frightful Howls Akashic record, it's Exuma the Obia Man, that entire album. Also, huge shout outs to his album Snake. There's so many good tracks on that one. Honestly, everything by Exuma is pretty much perfect. Exuma 2 with Damn Fool and Bale, Paul Simon Non-Tooth, Fire in the Hole. Ugh, perfect. But yeah, my choice today is definitely Mama Lai Papa Lai.
Hell yeah. Akashic record for the day. Rob Johnson, Me and the Devil Blues, the OG of Soap and Skin's Me and the Devil.
Yes.
Itself a alleged product of a pact with the devil to teach Rob Johnson how to play guitar.
Hell yeah, brother.
Other suggestion is Tartini's Violin Sonata in G minor.
Oh shit.
Which is the product of a dream that he had in which he sold his soul to the devil in exchange for the ability to have every one of his desires, and that being a piece that the devil that he had pacted with played on the violin. One of the classic deals with the devil, if you will.
Yeah, the Devil's Trill.
Exactly.
Amazing.
The one.
What's our license to depart?
So our license to depart for today is inspired itself by Pacts and is one of the most famous examples of a pact with the devil or many devils that was produced as evidence at the trial of Urbain Grandier in 1634.
Oh hell yes. All right, I wanna hear it. Give it to us nice and smooth.
We, the influential Lucifer, the young Satan, Beelzebub, Leviathan, Elimi, and Astaroth, together with others, have today accepted the covenant pact of Urbain Grandier, who was ours. And him do we promise the love of women, the flower of virgins, the respect of monarchs, honors, lusts, and powers. He will go whoring 3 days long. The carousal will be dear to him. He offers us once in the year a seal of blood under the feet. He will trample the holy things of the church, and he will ask us many questions. With this pact, he will live 20 years happy on the earth of men, and will later join us to sin against God. Bound in hell, in the council of demons, Lucifer, Beelzebub, Satan, Astaroth, Leviathan, Elimi, the seals placed with the devil, the master, and the demons, princes of the Lord. Balberith, writer.